and fuel established as dependent? Which one is established first? If either is established as an entity first, without any reliance on the existence or nature of the other, that member of the pair would have a claim to being the basis in an asymmetrical dependency relation, and the opponent would have the counterexample necessary to refute the analysis in chapters 8 and 9. The most obvious form at such an asymmetric dependence could take would involve the dependence of fire on fuel. Nagarjuna argues that this is impossible to maintain. 9. If fire depends on fuel, it would be the establishment of an established fire. And the fuel could be fuel without any fire. There are two arguments here. In the first two lines, Nagarjuna argues that if fire were to depend upon fuel, fire would be doubly established. The point is that in order for the fuel to count as fuel, the existence of the fire must have already been established. Indeed, the fuel depends upon the fire for its character as fuel. So to say then that the fire is dependent upon the fuel would be to argue that something whose existence is already presupposed if the fuel is to exist depends for its existence on that fuel. Note that this is only problematic for the opponent. That is, for one who accepts, as Nagarjuna does, the mutual interdependence of phenomena, it is in fact true that fire depends upon fuel and that fuel depends upon fire. But the opponent at this stage in the argument argues that fire exists only dependently, but dependently on independent fuel. So Nagarjuna only needs to show that position to be untenable. And the problem for the opponent is simply that the fuel he wants to exist independently can only do so in the presence of fire, which itself is merely dependent. Second, Nagarjuna argues, this would entail the absurd independent establishment of fuel as fuel. For fuel to be established independently as fuel in the absence of fire would be for there to be some characteristic of fuel that could be specified independently of fire that makes it fuel. But there is none. What makes fuel fuel is that it is combustible. 10. If that on which an entity depends is established on the basis of the entity depending on it. What is established in dependence on what? So in order to establish the existence of fuel as fuel, we must establish the existence of fire. In order for something to be fire, it must be consuming fuel. Neither depends asymmetrically on the other. 11. What entity is established through dependence? If it is not established, then how could it depend? However, if it is established merely through dependence, that dependence makes no sense. Now Nagarjuna draws the general ontological moral from this discussion of the putative counterexample. If an entity is inherently existent, it must be independently established as an entity and with its own nature. So no entity could be established as inherently existent through dependence on any other entity. Only inherently existent entities could be independent. To establish something as inherently existent through its dependence on something else is incoherent. So since entities can be established neither through independence nor through dependence, there is no way to establish anything as an entity in its own right. 12. Fire is not dependent upon fuel. Fire is not independent of fuel. Fuel is not dependent upon fire. Fuel is not independent of fire. That is, neither fuel nor fire can be established as independent bases of predication separate from one another that then stand in accidental relations to one another. There are not two entities, fire and fuel, which then are related either by dependence or interdependence. 13. Fire does not come from something else, nor is fire in fuel itself. Moreover, fire and the rest are just like the moved, the not moved, and the goer. Though, as verse 12 grants, fire exists only in relation to fuel, it would not be correct to assert that fuel as an independent entity somehow produces fire. The analysis and the conclusion are strictly analogous to that regarding motion and the mover. We neither can say that motion is the same as the mover nor that they are different entities. We cannot say that motion is present in the unmoved, the moving, or the yet to move. Similarly, we cannot say that fire is the same as the fuel or that it is different. Nor can we say that it is present in the unburned, the burning, or the yet-to-be-burned fuel. The next verse emphasizes this point. 14. Fuel is not fire. Fire does not arise from anything different from fuel. Fire does not possess fuel. Fuel is not in fire, nor vice versa. 15. Through discussion of fire and fuel. The self and the aggregates, the pot and cloth all together, without remainder, have been explained. The fire and fuel example is used as an analogy for a number of different cases of relations between bases and their attributes, including the relation between the putative self and its aggregates, that is, the components of the personality. But there are other stock examples, the relation between the pot and its properties, and between the cloth and its thread, that are used to try to defend these asymmetrical dependence relations between inherently existent bases and the properties they support. Nagarjuna is simply asserting the complete generality of this argument. It applies, mutatis mutandis, to all of these cases. 16. I do not think that those who teach that the self is the same as or different from the entities understand the meaning of the doctrine. This colophon verse reminds us that when existence is understood in terms of emptiness, and when entities are regarded as purely relational in character, identity and difference can only be understood conventionally. This applies not only with respect to apparently distinct entities, but also to the relation between parts and wholes, things and their attributes, events and their causes, and, as Nagarjuna emphasizes here, self and the objects of awareness. Strict identity and difference, as determined by reference to phenomena themselves, are only conceivable from the incoherent standpoint of inherent existence.